January 23, 1942. The waters of Balikpapan Bay shimmer with an eerie orange glow, reflecting the towering flames that consume the Dutch oil refineries along Borneo's eastern coast. The acrid smoke of burning petroleum mingles with the tropical humidity, creating a suffocating blanket that hangs over the invasion fleet. 16 Japanese transport vessels sit like sleeping giants in the harbor, their hulls packed with troops of the Sakaguchi detachment. The rhythmic thrum of diesel engines echoes across the water as landing craft prepare to ferry soldiers to the beaches. In the distance, the silhouettes of destroyers patrol the perimeter, their sleek forms cutting through the darkness with practiced precision. Captain Shoji Nishimura stands on the bridge of the light cruiser Naka, his weathered hands gripping the rail as he surveys the scene before him. The flames from the destroyed refineries cast dancing shadows across his face, highlighting the confidence etched in his features. Behind him, his officers murmur in hushed tones about the magnificent spectacle unfolding, another jewel of the Dutch East Indies falling into imperial hands. The captain's eyes gleam with the same certainty that has driven the Japanese Navy's spectacular conquest across the Pacific. They possess the finest torpedoes in the world, the feared Type 93 Long Lance, and the most skilled night-fighting force ever assembled. What could possibly challenge their supremacy in these waters? The smell of cordite and burning oil fills the night air as the last of the Dutch demolition charges detonate in the distance. Each explosion sends shock waves through the water, creating ripples that lap against the Japanese vessels with gentle persistence. The sound of metal twisting and concrete crumbling carries across the bay, a symphony of destruction that should have been sweet music to imperial ears. Yet something feels different about this night. The darkness beyond the burning refineries seems deeper, more ominous. Unknown to the confident Japanese commanders, 4 American destroyers are racing through that very darkness, their crews preparing for a torpedo attack that would shatter Japanese illusions of invincibility. This was the moment when Japan's greatest naval weapon would meet America's desperate ingenuity, when boastful confidence would collide with grim determination, and when the roar of burning oil would be drowned by the thunder of naval combat that would echo across the Pacific for years to come. The Japanese Empire's expansion across the Pacific in early 1942 represented one of the most audacious military campaigns in modern history. Within months of Pearl Harbor, Imperial forces had swept across thousands of miles of ocean, capturing Wake Island, Hong Kong, Singapore, and the Dutch East Indies with a speed that stunned the world. At the heart of this maritime blitzkrieg lay an unshakable confidence in Japanese naval superiority, a confidence built on decades of innovation, training, and, most importantly, the development of the most devastating torpedo ever created. The Type 93 torpedo, known to Allied forces as the Long Lance, represented the pinnacle of Japanese naval technology. Unlike American torpedoes that relied on compressed air for propulsion, the Long Lance burned pure oxygen and alcohol, creating a weapon of unprecedented range and speed. Measuring over 30 feet in length with a 24-inch diameter, these mechanical monsters could race through the water at 52 knots for 20 miles, carrying warheads containing over 1,000 pounds of explosive. No other navy possessed anything comparable. American torpedoes could barely manage half the range and speed, while their reliability remained questionable at best. Japanese naval doctrine had been shaped by this technological advantage. The concept of Kantai-Kessen, the decisive battle, envisioned a single, overwhelming engagement that would destroy enemy fleets in one catastrophic encounter. Night fighting became an art form within the Imperial Navy, with crews training relentlessly to execute precise torpedo attacks under cover of darkness. Officers spoke with pride of their ability to strike unseen from distances that enemy commanders could barely comprehend. The Long Lance had become more than a weapon. It was a symbol of Japanese naval supremacy, proof that Eastern engineering could surpass Western technology. Captain Nishimura embodied this confidence as he led the Western attack unit toward Borneo. His destroyer flotilla had been specifically chosen for this operation because of their mastery of torpedo warfare. The ships under his command, Harusami, Samidare, Udachi, Asagumo, Minagumo, Natsugumo, Umikaze, Kawakaze, Yamakaze, and Suzukaze, represented the finest night-fighting force in the Pacific. Each vessel carried the deadly long-lance torpedoes, and their crews had drilled endlessly in the precise maneuvers required to launch coordinated attacks against enemy formations. The Balikpapan operation exemplified Japanese strategic thinking. The oil refineries of Borneo were crucial to the empire's war machine, but they also represented a symbolic victory over Western colonial power. Dutch resistance had already been broken at Tarakan, where Japanese forces had demonstrated the futility of opposing imperial expansion. Now, as they approached Balikpapan, Japanese commanders expected another swift victory. The Dutch garrison was small and poorly equipped, while American naval forces remained scattered and demoralized following Pearl Harbor. Intelligence reports suggested minimal Allied naval presence in the area. A few obsolete American destroyers might attempt to interfere, but what could such antiquated vessels accomplish against the might of the Imperial Navy? Japanese officers dismissed American torpedo capabilities as inferior in every respect. Their Mark 15 torpedoes were slower, shorter-ranged, and notoriously unreliable. Even if American ships managed to close within range, their weapons would likely malfunction before reaching their targets. This technological superiority bred a dangerous overconfidence within Japanese ranks. Officers spoke casually of endless torpedoes and invincible night-fighting abilities. Training exercises had demonstrated time and again that Japanese forces could overwhelm any opposition through superior weapons and tactics. The long-lance torpedo had never failed them. Why should Balikpapan be any different? Yet, as the invasion fleet approached its destination, subtle signs suggested that this operation might not unfold according to plan. Dutch aircraft had already attacked the convoy, managing to sink the transport Nanamaru and damage several other vessels. Submarine contacts had been reported throughout the journey, forcing the escorts to divert from their planned routes. Most troubling of all, the massive fires visible from Balikpapan indicated that Dutch forces had successfully destroyed the very oil facilities that Japan sought to capture intact. These were omens that confident Japanese commanders chose to ignore. They had witnessed too many swift victories to doubt their inevitable success. The Empire's naval forces had proven unstoppable from Hawaii to Singapore. A handful of American destroyers could hardly challenge the supremacy of the long-lance torpedo and the skill of Japanese night fighters. But confidence, however well-founded, could become a liability when it blinded commanders to changing circumstances. The Pacific War was about to teach the Imperial Navy its first harsh lesson about the dangers of overestimating one's own capabilities while underestimating those of a determined enemy. The 4 American destroyers, racing toward Balikpapan that night, carried no illusions of technological superiority. USS John D. Ford, Parrott, Pope, and Paul Jones were veterans of a different era, their hulls scarred by years of peacetime service and their equipment showing the strain of constant operations. These ships possessed none of the advanced capabilities that Japanese commanders took for granted. Their torpedoes were older, slower, and less reliable. Their crews had trained for conventional naval warfare, not the specialized night-fighting techniques that the Imperial Navy had perfected. Yet what these American sailors lacked in equipment, they compensated for with desperation and determination. The months following Pearl Harbor had been an unending series of defeats and retreats. Singapore had fallen, the Philippines were under siege, and the Dutch East Indies crumbled before Japanese advances. Every day brought news of fresh disasters, of Allied positions overrun and fleets scattered. The men aboard these destroyers understood that they were witnessing the collapse of Western power in the Pacific. Commander Paul Talbot, leading the destroyer division from aboard John D. Ford, embodied the quiet resolve that would characterize American naval forces throughout the war. He possessed no technological advantages over his Japanese opponents. His ships were older and his weapons inferior. But Talbot understood something that overconfident Japanese commanders had forgotten. Victory belonged not always to the superior force, but to the one that used its assets most effectively. The American plan was born of necessity rather than doctrine. With no hope of matching Japanese firepower in a conventional engagement, Talbot decided to rely on surprise and audacity. His destroyers would penetrate the enemy anchorage under cover of darkness, launch their torpedoes at point-blank range, and retreat before Japanese forces could respond effectively. It was a desperate gamble, one that violated virtually every principle of safe naval warfare. Japanese tactical doctrine assumed that enemy forces would engage at long range, allowing the superior speed and range of the Long Lance to dominate the battle. Nishimura's destroyers were positioned to intercept any approaching threats well before they could close within effective torpedo range. The Japanese commander had studied American capabilities extensively and concluded that their obsolete destroyers posed minimal threat to his overwhelming force. This assessment proved fatally flawed. While Japanese officers had mastered the technical specifications of American weapons, they had failed to account for the unpredictability of desperate men facing seemingly impossible odds. Talbot's destroyers were indeed inferior in every measurable category, but their crews possessed something that could not be quantified in range: tables or speed calculations. The willingness to risk everything for a chance at victory. The contrast between Japanese expectation and American reality would define the coming engagement, where Japanese commanders anticipated a conventional night action decided by superior weapons and training. They would instead face an unprecedented penetration of their defensive perimeter by ships that had no business surviving such an attack. The Long Lance torpedo, designed to dominate battles fought at extreme range, would prove less effective against enemies who closed to knife-fighting distance. As the two forces converged in the waters off Balikpapan, neither side fully understood what they were about to experience. Japanese officers expected another demonstration of their technological supremacy, while American sailors prepared for what they assumed would be a suicidal final charge. Instead, both would discover that the Pacific War would be decided not by the quality of weapons alone, but by the ingenuity and determination of the men who wielded them. The night of January 23rd had already proven eventful for the Japanese invasion force. Dutch Martin B-10 bombers had attacked throughout the afternoon, managing to score hits on several transports despite heavy anti-aircraft fire. The loss of Nanamaru had been particularly galling, as it demonstrated that Allied forces retained the ability to strike back against Imperial expansion. Submarine attacks had forced the escorts to maintain constant vigilance, with sonar contacts reported throughout the convoy's approach to Balikpapan. Yet these attacks had done little more than annoy Japanese commanders. One transport lost, a few minor casualties, some damage to secondary vessels. These were acceptable losses for an operation of such strategic importance. Captain Nishimura continued to exude confidence as his flotilla took up positions around the anchorage. His destroyers formed a protective screen around the vulnerable transports, their Type 93 torpedoes ready to engage any enemy foolish enough to challenge Imperial supremacy. The burning oil refineries of Balikpapan provided an almost theatrical backdrop for the unfolding drama. Massive fires reached hundreds of feet into the night sky, casting an orange glow that could be seen from 50 miles away. The destruction was so complete that Dutch demolition teams had exceeded even their own expectations. Storage tanks exploded in sequence, sending shock waves across the water that rattled the hulls of Japanese vessels. The acrid smoke created a haze that limited visibility, though Japanese lookouts remained confident in their ability to detect approaching threats. Radio communications crackled with reports from various units as the landing operation commenced. Colonel Kanauji's raid unit had successfully infiltrated Wayne River behind Dutch defensive lines, while General Sakaguchi's main force prepared to assault the beaches near Mangar Airfield. Everything proceeded according to plan. The Dutch garrison appeared to be retreating inland, abandoning the vital port facilities to Japanese occupation. Within hours, Balikpapan would join the growing list of imperial conquests. It was precisely this atmosphere of success and confidence that created the conditions for tactical surprise. Japanese lookouts scanned the waters for approaching enemies, but their attention focused on the seaward approaches where conventional attacks might be expected. The assumption that enemy forces would engage at long range using standard naval tactics shaped Japanese defensive dispositions. Nishimura's destroyers patrolled the outer perimeter, ready to intercept threats before they could close to effective range. This tactical rigidity would prove costly when confronted by an enemy willing to abandon conventional wisdom. Talbot's destroyers approached from an unexpected direction, hugging the coastline to avoid detection and using the smoke from burning refineries to mask their advance. Japanese radar technology remained primitive in 1942, while lookouts struggled to distinguish ship silhouettes against the backdrop of fires and smoke that dominated the horizon. The confidence that permeated Japanese ranks extended from the highest commanders to the lowest ratings. Officers spoke casually of their technological advantages, while sailors prepared their weapons with the calm assurance of men who had never known defeat. The long-lance torpedoes resting in their tubes represented the finest naval weapons in the world, backed by crews whose night-fighting skills were legendary throughout the Imperial Navy. Yet confidence could become complacency when success bred assumptions about enemy capabilities and intentions. Japanese commanders had studied American naval doctrine extensively, but their analysis focused on conventional engagements between organized fleets. They had not prepared for the possibility that desperate enemies might abandon standard tactics entirely, accepting enormous risks for the chance to inflict unexpected damage. The stage was set for a collision between Japanese expectations and American desperation. In the waters around Balikpapan, superior technology and training would meet audacity and improvisation. The outcome would depend not merely on the specifications of weapons and ships, but on the willingness of commanders to adapt when reality failed to match their carefully constructed plans. At 02:35 on January 24th, the first sign of approaching disaster presented itself to Japanese forces in the most deceptively innocent manner imaginable. Lookouts aboard Nishimura's destroyers spotted 4 unidentified vessels approaching through the darkness, their silhouettes barely visible against the smoke-filled horizon. Standard procedure required challenging unknown ships to identify themselves, and signal lamps flashed the prescribed codes into the night. No response came from the approaching vessels. They continued their steady advance toward the anchorage, maintaining course and speed with mechanical precision. Japanese signalmen repeated their challenges, growing increasingly concerned as the strangers ignored all attempts at communication. Protocol demanded that unidentified ships be engaged as hostile contacts, yet something about their approach suggested friendly intentions. The unknown vessels moved with the confident bearing of ships that belonged in these waters. Their formation appeared disciplined and professional, exactly what might be expected from Japanese naval forces returning from patrol. In the confusion of a major amphibious operation, with dozens of ships moving through unfamiliar waters, such encounters were hardly unusual. Communication failures occurred regularly, particularly when radio silence was maintained to avoid enemy detection. Commander Nishimura faced a critical decision. His standing orders were clear: engage any unidentified vessel that failed to respond to challenges. Yet the tactical situation argued for caution. The landing operation was proceeding smoothly, with troops already moving ashore under cover of darkness. Opening fire on potentially friendly forces could disrupt the entire operation, while alerting enemy positions to Japanese movements. The decisive factor in Nishimura's reasoning was the sheer audacity required for enemy ships to penetrate so deeply into Japanese-controlled waters. American naval forces had demonstrated no such capability during previous engagements. Their commanders appeared cautious to the point of timidity, avoiding contact whenever Japanese superiority became apparent. The idea that obsolete American destroyers would dare to approach within torpedo range of a superior Japanese force seemed beyond credibility. This assessment proved fatally flawed. Nishimura's experience with American naval tactics was based on conventional engagements where both sides attempted to maximize their advantages while minimizing risks. He could not conceive of a strategy based on accepting enormous risks for the chance to achieve tactical surprise. The approaching vessels had to be Japanese ships returning from patrol, their communications equipment damaged, or their operators inexperienced. The unknown destroyers passed within a few hundred yards of Japanese escorts, close enough for lookouts to observe details of their construction and armament. Yet the darkness and smoke made positive identification impossible, while the strangers' confident bearing continued to suggest friendly intent. Minutes ticked by as the unidentified vessels maintained their steady course toward the transport anchorage. At 02:45, the last opportunity for Japanese forces to prevent disasters slipped away as the unknown ships disappeared into the smoke and confusion surrounding the landing operation. Nishimura's destroyers resumed their patrol patterns, confident that they had encountered a friendly force whose communications had failed. Radio operators continued monitoring for distress signals, while lookouts scanned the waters for other potential threats. The American destroyers had achieved what Japanese tactical doctrine considered impossible. They had penetrated a defended anchorage without being detected or engaged. Talbot's gamble had succeeded beyond his wildest expectations. His ships now occupied positions from which they could launch point-blank torpedo attacks against defenseless transports. The stage was set for a demonstration of how desperation and audacity could overcome technological superiority and numerical advantage. Yet even as the American destroyers prepared to attack, Japanese confidence remained unshaken. Officers continued their routine duties, secure in the knowledge that their superior weapons and training had created an impregnable defensive perimeter. The long-lance torpedoes that had dominated every previous engagement waited in their tubes, ready to destroy any enemy foolish enough to challenge imperial naval supremacy. The collision between expectation and reality was now only minutes away. In the darkness around Balikpapan, Japanese assumptions about American capabilities were about to be shattered by an attack that violated every principle of conventional naval warfare. The transformation from confidence to chaos occurred with stunning rapidity. At 02:57, lookouts aboard the Japanese minesweeper W-15 spotted the approaching American destroyers emerging from the smoke that had concealed their advance. Yet even at this critical moment, the power of assumption continued to shape Japanese responses. The watchkeepers assumed they were observing the cruiser Naka returning from patrol, her silhouette distorted by smoke and darkness. This fatal misidentification provided Talbot's destroyers with the final seconds they needed to achieve optimal attack positions. USS Parrott, leading the American formation, closed to within 200 yards of the unsuspecting minesweeper before opening fire. The first salvo of 5-inch shells erupted from her guns with brilliant flashes that illuminated the anchorage like daylight, revealing the full scope of the Japanese force to American gunners. The sight that greeted American eyes exceeded their most optimistic expectations. 16 transport vessels lay at anchor in neat formations, their hulls silhouetted against the burning oil refineries beyond. These were not the scattered, fleeting targets that characterized most naval engagements, but stationary ships packed with troops and supplies. The opportunity for devastating attack was unprecedented in the Pacific War. Parrot's initial torpedo spread missed the nimble minesweeper, but the attack signal had been given. USS John D. Ford and Paul Jones followed their leader into the anchorage, their crews working with desperate efficiency to bring guns and torpedo tubes to bear on the mass of enemy shipping. The element of surprise was complete, yet the Americans knew their advantage would last only moments before Japanese escorts responded with overwhelming firepower. The first Japanese transport to die was Kuretake Maru, struck by a torpedo from Parrot at 03:00. The explosion lifted the vessel's stern from the water before breaking her back in a cascade of debris and flame. Troops packed into her holds had no chance of escape as the transport settled rapidly by the bow, her superstructure disappearing beneath the oil-stained waters of Balikpapan Bay. Sumanura Maru followed minutes later, struck by two torpedoes that detonated almost simultaneously. The massive explosion sent shock waves through the anchorage, rattling the hulls of nearby vessels and shattering windows in the port facilities ashore. Ammunition stored in the transport's holds added to the destruction as secondary explosions tore through her hull, sending columns of flame hundreds of feet into the air. Japanese response came slowly, hampered by the confusion that gripped the anchorage as officers struggled to comprehend what was happening. The idea that enemy destroyers could penetrate so deeply into defended waters remained incomprehensible to commanders trained in conventional naval tactics. Initial reports suggested a submarine attack, as the darkness made surface ships virtually invisible until their guns began firing. Captain Nishimura aboard Naka received the first coherent report at 03:05, informing him that enemy destroyers were attacking the transport anchorage. The news struck him like a physical blow, shattering his confidence in Japanese defensive arrangements. How had American ships penetrated his carefully constructed perimeter? Where were the long-lance torpedoes that should have destroyed any approaching enemy? The answer lay in the rigid adherence to tactical doctrine that had shaped Japanese defensive dispositions. Nishimura's destroyers were positioned to engage enemies at long range, using their superior weapons to dominate conventional naval battles. They were not prepared for opponents who closed to knife-fighting distance, accepting enormous risks to achieve tactical surprise. USS Ford and Paul Jones continued their rampage through the anchorage, their 5-inch guns firing as rapidly as crews could load and aim. The transport Tatsutake Maru erupted in flames as high-explosive shells penetrated her superstructure, while Ehime Maru listed heavily after taking multiple hits below the waterline. The Japanese merchant vessels had no defenses against naval gunfire, their thin hulls offering no protection against armor-piercing shells. Yet the Americans' triumph was necessarily brief. Japanese escort vessels were finally responding to the attack, their searchlights sweeping the waters as crews prepared their weapons for action. The long-lance torpedoes that had failed to prevent the American approach would now be brought to bear in a desperate attempt to destroy the raiders before they could escape. The patrol boat P-37 was first to engage, her guns opening fire at 03:08 as she attempted to intercept the withdrawing American destroyers. Her shells fell short, but the muzzle flashes provided Japanese gunners with target references for more accurate shooting. Within minutes, the entire anchorage would be illuminated by the cross-crossing beams of searchlights and the brilliant flashes of naval gunfire. Talbot knew his raiders had only minutes before. Overwhelming Japanese firepower made their position untenable. The element of surprise was gone, and his obsolete destroyers could not hope to engage Japanese escorts in conventional battle. Yet in those critical 15 minutes, American audacity had achieved what technological superiority could not: the destruction of a significant portion of the Japanese invasion force. The transport Teri Maru became the fourth victim as she attempted to get underway, struck by a torpedo that detonated beneath her engine spaces. The explosion lifted her stern clear of the water before she broke apart in a shower of steel and flame. Survivors struggled in the oil-covered water as their ship disappeared beneath the waves, taking with her another portion of the Sakaguchi detachment. As the American destroyers began their withdrawal, racing through the smoke and flame that now dominated Balikpapan Bay, the full extent of Japanese losses became apparent. 4 transports had been sunk, with several others damaged and listing. Hundreds of Japanese soldiers had perished in the holds of their transports, while thousands more found themselves stranded as their equipment and supplies disappeared beneath the waves. The confident predictions of endless Japanese success had been shattered in a single hour of combat. The long-lance torpedoes that should have guaranteed victory had never been fired, while the night-fighting skills that defined Japanese naval doctrine had proved useless against an enemy willing to abandon conventional tactics. For the first time since Pearl Harbor, Japanese naval forces had been caught, completely unprepared by American innovation and determination. Yet, perhaps the most shocking realization for Japanese commanders was how easily their defensive perimeter had been penetrated. The technological superiority and tactical excellence they had counted on meant nothing when facing an enemy desperate enough to accept enormous risks for the chance at tactical surprise. The Pacific War had just become far more unpredictable than Japanese planners had ever imagined. The sound that would haunt Japanese naval officers for the remainder of the war was not the thunder of their own guns or the whistle of long-lance torpedoes, but the steady throb of American diesel engines disappearing into the darkness, carrying with them proof that imperial naval supremacy was not as absolute as they had believed. The immediate aftermath of the Balikpapan raid revealed the profound psychological impact that a single successful attack could have on forces accustomed to uninterrupted victory. As dawn broke over the oil-blackened waters of the bay, Japanese officers surveyed a scene of destruction that challenged every assumption about American naval capabilities. 4 transports rested on the bottom, their superstructures barely visible above the oil-slicked surface. Debris floated everywhere: life preservers, wooden crates, personal belongings of soldiers who would never see Japan again. Captain Nishimura stood on the bridge of Naka, his weathered face reflecting the strain of the night's events. The confident officer who had led his flotilla into these waters just hours earlier now grappled with a reality that defied explanation. How had obsolete American destroyers penetrated his defenses so completely? Where had the vaunted Japanese night-fighting capabilities failed so catastrophically? The patrol boat P-37 burned fiercely near the harbor entrance, struck by American gunfire as she attempted to intercept the raiders. Her crew had fought bravely, but their weapons proved inadequate against determined enemies willing to accept losses to achieve their objectives. The sight of her twisted hull served as a stark reminder that Japanese naval superiority was not absolute. Reports from surviving transport captains painted a picture of devastating efficiency in the American attack. The enemy destroyers had moved through the anchorage with mechanical precision, their guns and torpedoes finding targets with deadly accuracy. Most disturbing of all was the realization that the raiders had escaped virtually unscathed, their withdrawal covered by the same smoke and confusion that had enabled their approach. Japanese losses extended far beyond the 4 sunken transports. Komagawa Maru had been damaged by near-miss explosions, while Hiteru Maru listed heavily after taking shell hits below the waterline. The seaplane tender Sanyo Maru reported casualties from splinter damage, and several smaller vessels had suffered varying degrees of harm. Most critically, nearly 400 soldiers of the Sakaguchi detachment had been killed or wounded, with their equipment and supplies lost in the depths of Balikpapan Bay. The human cost of the disaster became apparent as rescue operations commenced throughout the morning. Survivors clung to wreckage in the oil-covered water, many of them seriously injured by explosions or burns. Medical personnel worked frantically to treat the wounded, but facilities ashore remained limited due to the ongoing landing operation. The scenes of suffering contrasted sharply with the confident predictions that had characterized Japanese planning for this operation. Yet perhaps the most significant damage was to Japanese confidence itself. Officers who had witnessed the attack struggled to explain how American forces had achieved such tactical surprise. The official reports would eventually blame communication failures and poor visibility, but privately, naval personnel recognized that something fundamental had changed in the Pacific War. The Americans were no longer the passive, demoralized enemy that Japanese planners had expected. The long-lance torpedoes that represented the pinnacle of Japanese naval technology had played no role in the night's events. Nishimura's destroyers had been perfectly positioned to intercept approaching enemies at long range, using their superior weapons to dominate any conventional engagement. Instead, they had been bypassed entirely by opponents willing to accept enormous risks to close within point-blank range of their targets. This tactical revolution had profound implications for future Japanese operations. If American commanders were prepared to abandon standard naval doctrine in favor of desperate expedients, then Japanese defensive planning would require fundamental revision. The assumption that enemies would behave predictably, engaging at maximum range to minimize their own losses, had proven dangerously flawed. Naval intelligence officers began urgent reviews of American capabilities and doctrine, searching for clues that might have predicted such an unorthodox attack. Yet their analysis revealed nothing in previous American naval behavior that suggested such audacity. The Balikpapan raid appeared to represent a complete departure from established patterns, a willingness to gamble everything on a single throw of the dice. The psychological transformation was equally significant for American naval forces. News of the successful raid spread rapidly through Allied commands, providing the first concrete evidence that Japanese naval supremacy could be challenged. The 4 obsolete destroyers that had seemed hopelessly outclassed had achieved what modern cruisers and battleships had failed to accomplish. They had struck a devastating blow against Japanese expansion. Commander Talbot's after-action report would become required reading throughout the U.S. Navy, studied for lessons that might be applied to future operations. The emphasis on tactical surprise, the willingness to accept enormous risks, and the importance of abandoning conventional doctrine when facing superior enemies would shape American naval thinking throughout the Pacific War. Yet, the raid's significance extended beyond mere tactical innovation. For the first time since Pearl Harbor, American naval forces had demonstrated that Japanese commanders could be caught off guard, that their technological advantages could be neutralized by superior tactics and determination. The myth of invincible Japanese night-fighting capabilities had been shattered in the waters off Balikpapan. The burning oil, refineries that had provided such a dramatic backdrop for the night's events continued to illuminate the bay. Throughout the following day, their flames served as a monument to Dutch determination to deny vital resources to Japanese occupation forces. Yet they also symbolized something else, the beginning of a new phase in the Pacific War, one in which American forces would increasingly challenge Japanese assumptions about their own invincibility, the symbol that would come to represent American abundance and industrial might in the months following. Balikpapan was neither complex nor sophisticated. It was the simple tin can, the humble container that preserved food for naval personnel serving thousands of miles from home. While Japanese forces operated on increasingly austere rations as their supply lines stretched across the vast Pacific, American sailors enjoyed an almost incredible variety of preserved foods that spoke to their nation's industrial capacity. Aboard the destroyers that had raided Balikpapan, mess cooks opened can after can of beef stew, fruit cocktail, and vegetables to feed crews exhausted by their night's work. The abundance seemed almost miraculous to men who had grown accustomed to shortages and rationing in the months following Pearl Harbor. Each tin represented not just nutrition, but the vast industrial machine that could produce millions of such containers while simultaneously building ships, aircraft, and weapons. Japanese sailors, by contrast, subsisted on increasingly meager rice rations, supplemented by whatever fish they could catch, or vegetables they could procure from occupied territories. The contrast was not immediately apparent in early 1942, but it would grow steadily more pronounced as the war continued. American industrial capacity would prove capable of not only equipping its own forces lavishly, but also supplying allies around the globe. The tin can became a recurring symbol throughout the Pacific War, representing the material abundance that democratic societies could mobilize when facing existential threats. Japanese prisoners of war would later express amazement at the quality and quantity of American rations, while their own forces struggled with hunger and malnutrition in the war's final stages. This disparity reflected fundamental differences between the two economic systems locked in mortal combat across the Pacific. American abundance extended far beyond food preservation. The 4 destroyers that had struck at Balikpapan carried ammunition loads that would have astounded their Japanese opponents. While Imperial Navy vessels operated under strict rationing of shells and torpedoes, American ships sailed with magazines packed to capacity. The luxury of expending ammunition freely in training exercises had created crews capable of devastating accuracy when combat demanded precision. This material abundance was matched by a philosophical commitment to preserving human life through superior equipment and supplies. American naval vessels carried extensive medical supplies, life-saving equipment, and rescue gear that reflected democratic values emphasizing individual worth. Japanese naval doctrine, by contrast, emphasized spiritual strength over material comfort, accepting casualties as inevitable consequences of combat. The tin can also symbolize American industrial innovation and efficiency. The technology required to preserve food in sealed containers, multiply it across millions of units, and distribute it globally represented achievements that Japanese industry could not match, despite its technological sophistication in specialized areas like torpedo design. Democratic societies proved capable of mobilizing resources on scales that authoritarian regimes could not sustain over extended periods. Throughout the remainder of the Pacific War, the simple tin can would serve as a reminder of the fundamental economic disparities that shaped the conflict's outcome. While Japanese forces grew steadily weaker as their supply lines collapsed under American pressure, Allied forces enjoyed increasing abundance as democratic industrial capacity reached full mobilization. The contrast between American plenty and Japanese want would become one of the war's defining characteristics. The transformation of Japanese naval confidence did not occur overnight, but the Balikpapan raid marked a crucial turning point in Imperial Navy psychology. Officers who had previously spoken casually of American naval inferiority began expressing more cautious assessments of enemy capabilities. The assumption that Japanese technological superiority guaranteed victory in any engagement had been shaken by the realization that desperate enemies might abandon conventional tactics entirely. This psychological shift manifested itself in multiple ways. Throughout subsequent Japanese operations, defensive dispositions became more conservative, with greater emphasis on close-range protection for valuable assets. The assumption that enemies would engage at maximum range, allowing long-lance torpedoes to dominate battles, gave way to recognition that American commanders might attempt close-range penetrations of defended areas. Intelligence officers began urgent reassessments of American naval doctrine, searching for patterns that might predict future unorthodox attacks. Yet, their analysis revealed a troubling reality. American naval forces appeared to be abandoning established patterns in favor of improvisational tactics designed to exploit specific Japanese vulnerabilities. This unpredictability made defensive planning far more difficult than Imperial Navy commanders had anticipated. The long-lance torpedo, which had symbolized Japanese naval supremacy, began to lose some of its psychological impact as officers recognized its limitations in close-range engagements. While the weapon remained superior to any Allied torpedo in terms of range and speed, Its advantages meant little if enemies closed to distances where conventional torpedoes could be equally effective. The entire strategic framework based on long-range night fighting required fundamental reconsideration. Japanese naval training began, incorporating scenarios based on enemy penetration of defensive perimeters, acknowledging the possibility that future opponents might employ the same tactics that had proven so successful at Balikpapan. Yet this adjustment came at a cost, as resources previously devoted to perfecting long-range torpedo attacks had to be diverted to close-range defensive preparations. The most profound transformation occurred in Japanese assessments of American naval personnel. Pre-war intelligence had characterized U.S. Navy officers as cautious and predictable, unlikely to take significant risks when facing superior opposition. The Balikpapan raid demonstrated that desperate circumstances could transform even conservative commanders into aggressive tacticians willing to gamble everything on audacious attacks. This realization carried implications far beyond naval warfare. If American forces were capable of such dramatic tactical innovation when facing impossible odds, then Japanese strategic planning would require much more flexibility than previously anticipated. The assumption that enemies would behave rationally, seeking to minimize their own losses while maximizing damage to Japanese forces, had proven dangerously naive. American naval doctrine underwent equally significant transformation following the successful raid. The emphasis on technological superiority and conventional engagement gave way to recognition that inferior forces could achieve decisive results through tactical innovation and operational surprise. Commander Talbot's report became required reading throughout the Pacific Fleet. Its lessons applied to subsequent operations with increasing sophistication. The willingness to accept enormous risks for the chance of achieving tactical surprise became a hallmark of American naval operations throughout 1942 and beyond. From the Doolittle Raid to the Battle of Midway, U.S. forces demonstrated repeatedly that conventional wisdom could be abandoned when circumstances demanded innovative solutions. This operational flexibility proved to be one of America's greatest strategic advantages throughout the Pacific War. Yet perhaps the most significant transformation was in American confidence itself. The months following Pearl Harbor had been characterized by an almost unending series of defeats and withdrawals. Japanese forces had appeared invincible, their technological advantages overwhelming. The Balikpapan raid provided the first concrete evidence that Imperial Navy forces could be surprised, defeated, and forced to acknowledge the reality of American naval competence. This psychological victory proved as important as the tactical success in shaping subsequent American operations. Naval personnel who had questioned their ability to compete with Japanese night-fighting expertise now understood that innovation and determination could overcome technological disadvantages. The myth of Japanese invincibility had been shattered in the waters off Borneo, replaced by growing confidence in American ability to adapt and overcome. The tin cans that fed American sailors during their long voyage home from Balikpapan carried more than preserved food. They represented a nation's commitment to supporting its forces with material abundance, while the successful raid they had just completed demonstrated that democratic values could inspire tactical innovations capable of defeating seemingly superior enemies. The combination of material and spiritual resources would prove decisive in the long struggle ahead. As 1942 progressed, the lessons of Balikpapan would be applied with increasing sophistication to naval operations throughout the Pacific. The willingness to abandon conventional doctrine when facing superior enemies, the emphasis on tactical surprise over technological advantage, and the recognition that desperate circumstances could inspire extraordinary innovation would characterize American naval warfare throughout the conflict. The humble destroyer crews who had dared to penetrate Japanese defensive perimeters had provided their navy with a new tactical philosophy that would serve it well in the battles to come. The morning, sun rising over Balikpapan Bay on January 24, 1942, illuminated more than the wreckage of Japanese transports and the continuing fires of Dutch oil refineries. It revealed a fundamental shift in the Pacific War's trajectory, a moment when confident assumptions collided with harsh reality, and neither side would ever view their enemy in quite the same way again. For Japanese naval officers, the dawn brought a sobering recognition that their technological superiority and tactical excellence meant nothing if enemies were willing to abandon conventional wisdom entirely. The long-lance torpedoes that had dominated every previous engagement had never been fired, while the night-fighting skills that defined Imperial Navy doctrine had proved useless against opponents who closed to knife-fighting range. Most troubling of all was the realization that American naval forces had demonstrated capabilities that Japanese intelligence had never anticipated. The confident boasts of endless torpedoes and invincible night-fighting abilities would never again carry the same conviction among Japanese naval personnel. The myth of technological determinism, the belief that superior weapons guaranteed victory regardless of circumstances, had been shattered by 4 obsolete American destroyers whose crews had dared to attempt the impossible. Future Japanese operations would be conducted with a new awareness of American unpredictability and a grudging respect for their tactical innovation. Yet the transformation extended far beyond military considerations. The Balikpapan raid represented the first crack in the facade of Japanese invincibility that had dominated Pacific waters since Pearl Harbor. For months, Imperial forces had advanced with mechanical precision, their victories appearing so inevitable that resistance seemed futile. The successful American attack demonstrated that Japanese expansion could be challenged, that their defensive arrangements contained vulnerabilities that could be exploited by determined enemies. This psychological victory proved as significant as the tactical success in reshaping Allied perceptions of the war's trajectory. Naval personnel throughout the Pacific Fleet studied Talbot's after-action report with growing excitement, recognizing that the principles of tactical surprise and operational audacity could be applied to future engagements. The emphasis on innovation over convention, on accepting enormous risks for the chance of decisive results, would characterize American naval warfare throughout the remainder of the conflict. The tin cans that had fed American sailors during their approach to Balikpapan became symbols of something larger than mere material abundance. They represented a democratic society's commitment to supporting its military forces with the best equipment and supplies that industrial capacity could provide. While Japanese forces operated under increasingly austere conditions as their supply lines stretched across vast oceanic distances, American personnel enjoyed access to resources that seemed almost miraculous to enemies. Accustomed to rationing and shortages, this material abundance reflected fundamental differences between democratic and authoritarian approaches to warfare. Where Japanese doctrine emphasized spiritual strength and acceptance of sacrifice, American strategy sought to maximize effectiveness while minimizing casualties through superior equipment and supplies. The contrast would become increasingly pronounced as the war continued, with Japanese forces growing steadily weaker while American capabilities expanded dramatically. The broader implications of the Balikpapan raid extended throughout the Pacific War and beyond, influencing naval doctrine, strategic thinking, and international perceptions of democratic resilience. The willingness of American forces to innovate when facing seemingly impossible odds, their capacity to transform defeat into opportunity through tactical creativity, and their ability to sustain operations across vast distances through industrial abundance would prove decisive in the long struggle ahead. Perhaps most importantly, the raid demonstrated that freedom itself could inspire tactical innovations that authoritarian regimes, despite their technological sophistication and military discipline, could not anticipate or counter effectively. The democratic tradition of individual initiative and creative problem-solving, when combined with material abundance and institutional flexibility, proved capable of overcoming advantages that had seemed insurmountable just hours before the attack began. The waters of Balikpapan Bay eventually cleared of oil and debris. The fires in the Dutch refineries were extinguished, and the Japanese occupation proceeded according to modified plans. Yet, something fundamental had changed in those dark hours when American destroyers raced through smoke and flame to strike at the heart of an enemy fleet. The confidence that had driven Japanese expansion across the Pacific had been tempered by recognition that their enemies possessed capabilities that could not be measured in range tables or speed calculations. The years that followed, as American industrial might reached full mobilization and Allied forces began their long advance across the Pacific, the lessons of Balikpapan would be applied with increasing sophistication to operations of ever greater scale and complexity. The humble tin can that fed American sailors would multiply into millions of containers supporting forces around the globe, while the tactical audacity demonstrated by 4 obsolete destroyers would inspire innovations that would ultimately bring the Japanese empire to its knees. The boastful confidence in endless torpedoes had been replaced by sober recognition that wars are won not by superior weapons alone, but by the wisdom to use whatever tools are available with maximum effectiveness. In the waters off Borneo, American naval forces had learned that desperate times called for desperate measures, while Japanese commanders had discovered that overconfidence could be as dangerous as any enemy torpedo. The Pacific War would never again be quite as predictable as either side had expected when the first shots were fired at Pearl Harbor. As the sun climbed higher over the oil-stained waters of Balikpapan Bay, it illuminated a truth that would resonate throughout the remainder of World War II. That freedom, when combined with material abundance and tactical innovation, possessed a power that no amount of technological superiority or military discipline could ultimately overcome. The tin cans and torpedo tubes had spoken their piece in the darkness, and the message would echo across the Pacific until the final Japanese surrender in Tokyo Bay.